The morning fog clung to the steel and glass facade of the Caldwell Industrial Building, mirroring the heavy feeling in Henry Wallace's chest. At 58 years old, Henry had dedicated over 3 decades of his life to this company. He knew every bolt, every production line, and every operational hiccup that could possibly occur within the sprawling manufacturing plant. He had built the supply chain division from the ground up, turning a struggling local operation into a global powerhouse that generated hundreds of millions in revenue annually. But today, the air in the office felt entirely different. It felt clinical. It felt cold. Henry adjusted his tie, a subtle silk pattern that his wife, Martha Wallace, had picked out for him for his last birthday. "It brings out the silver in your hair," she had said, with a warm smile, pouring him his second cup of coffee before he left the house at dawn. Martha was his anchor, the one constant in a world that seemed to be spinning increasingly out of control. They had been married for 35 years, weathering storms both personal and professional. She had always told him that his loyalty to Caldwell Industrial was a rare trait. But lately, she had started to worry that his loyalty was unrequited. As Henry stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, he noticed unfamiliar faces. Sharp-suited young men and women clutching sleek tablets were weaving in and out of the conference rooms. They moved with an arrogant efficiency, speaking in hushed, clipped tones. These were the consultants. Zenith Dynamics, to be precise. The rumor mill had been churning for weeks, but seeing them here, dissecting his life's work, made the threat visceral. He walked toward his office, passing the glass-walled suite of Julian Thorne, the vice president of operations. Julian was a decade younger than Henry, a man whose ambition vastly outstripped his actual understanding of the business. Julian had climbed the corporate ladder not through hard work or innovation, but through ruthless politicking and an uncanny ability to take credit for the successes of others, usually Henry's. Today, Julian was huddled with Felix Harper, the lead consultant from Zenith Dynamics. Felix looked barely old enough to rent a car, yet he carried himself with the smug authority of someone who held people's livelihoods in the palm of his hand. Julian caught Henry's eye through the glass and offered a thin, mechanical smile before quickly turning his back. Henry felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Something was fundamentally wrong. By mid-morning, the entire floor was summoned to the main auditorium. Richard Caldwell, the chief executive officer, stood at the podium. Richard was a legacy appointment, the son of the founder, and a man who cared more about quarterly stock bumps than the people who actually built his products. Richard cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone. "Team," Richard began, his voice booming hollowly across the room. "We are entering a new era of corporate agility. To remain competitive in a rapidly evolving global market, we must optimize our operational matrix. That means leaning into synergies and restructuring our core assets. Zenith Dynamics is partnering with us to streamline our overhead and maximize shareholder value." Henry translated the corporate jargon effortlessly. They were going to fire people to save money. He glanced around the room. The faces of his colleagues, men and women he had mentored for years, were pale and drawn. The rest of the day was a blur of whispered anxieties. Henry tried to focus on his quarterly projections, but his mind kept wandering back to the smug look on Felix Harper's face. At precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, his desk phone rang. It was Diana Pierce from Human Resources. "Henry," Diana said, her voice tight and entirely devoid of its usual warmth, "could you come down to conference room B? Julian and I need to have a quick word with you." The walk down the hallway felt like a march to the gallows. Henry opened the door to conference room B to find Diana sitting formally at the table, her hands clasped over a manila folder. Julian Thorne was leaning against the window, looking out over the parking lot, while Felix Harper sat at the table, tapping his expensive pen against a notebook. "Have a seat, Henry," Julian said without turning around. Henry remained standing for a moment, letting the silence stretch, before deliberately pulling out a chair and sitting down. "What is this about, Julian?" Julian finally turned, his expression carefully arranged into a mask of corporate sympathy. "Henry, as Richard mentioned this morning, we are implementing a comprehensive restructuring initiative. Felix and his team at Zenith Dynamics have conducted an exhaustive audit of our leadership structure. We need to become leaner, more agile. Unfortunately, that means your position as Senior Director of Supply Chain is being eliminated. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Eliminated. 30 years of sweat, missed family dinners, and relentless dedication casually dismissed by a man who didn't know the difference between a freight invoice and a bill of lading. Eliminated, Henry repeated, his voice dangerously calm. I run the most profitable division in this entire company. My team has reduced logistical costs by 20% over the past 3 years. You cannot run the Eastern Seaboard operations without my proprietary vendor network. Felix Harper stopped tapping his pen and leaned forward, offering a patronizing smile. Actually, Mr. Wallace, our analysis indicates that your role is highly redundant. The processes you established are excellent, which is precisely why we believe they can be managed by a more streamlined junior team under Mr. Thorne's direct supervision. They were stealing his work. They were going to take the systems he had spent a lifetime building and hand them over to a cheaper, younger employee. All while Julian claimed the credit. Diana Pierce opened the manila folder and slid a thick stack of papers toward him. Henry, we value your contributions over the years. We are offering you a severance package. 6 months of pay, plus continued health coverage for that period. However, the package is contingent upon you signing a non-compete agreement and staying on for a transition period of 4 weeks to train your replacement. Henry stared at the papers. They wanted him to train the person who was taking his livelihood. They wanted him to hand over the keys to his kingdom and then quietly disappear into the background. The sheer audacity of the demand ignited a cold, hard fury deep within his chest. You want me to train my replacement, Henry said, looking directly into Julian's eyes. You want me to teach some kid how to do a job that took me 30 years to master, so you can save a few pennies on the balance sheet. It is a standard transition protocol, Julian replied, his voice defensive. It is a very generous package, Henry. Given your age, finding another executive position might take some time. I would advise you to take the deal. The subtle jab at his age was the breaking point. At 58, Henry possessed more knowledge and capability than Julian and Felix combined. He stood up, leaving the folder untouched on the table. I will not sign anything today, Henry said, his voice steady and commanding, and I will not be training my replacement. You have my resignation effective immediately. Diana looked panicked. Henry, please, if you resign, you forfeit the severance package entirely. You will leave with nothing. I am leaving with my dignity, Henry said. Good luck running the division, Julian. You are going to need it. He walked out of the room without looking back. The drive home was a blur. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the highway as Henry grappled with the reality of his situation. He had no job. He had no severance. He was 58 years old, thrust into a job market that prized youth over experience. But beneath the fear, there was a growing spark of defiance. When he pulled into his driveway, Martha was waiting on the porch. She took one look at his face and knew immediately. She didn't ask questions. She simply walked up to him, wrapped her arms around him, and held him tight. They let me go, Henry whispered into her hair. 30 years, Martha, and they just threw me away. I know, she said softly, pulling back to look him in the eye. And they are fools, but you are Henry Wallace. You built that division from nothing. If they think they can just take your life's work and discard you, they are severely underestimating you. They sat in their kitchen late into the night, drinking tea and formulating a plan. Henry explained how Julian and Felix intended to utilize his proprietary vendor network and his custom logistical algorithms to maintain the division's profitability. The problem for them, Henry said, a slow smile spreading across his face, is that those vendor relationships are not with Caldwell Industrial. They are with me. The suppliers trust my word. They give us preferential rates because we have done business together for decades. If I am not there, those rates will disappear. Martha's eyes gleamed with understanding. And what about your algorithms? The software you designed to track the shipments? I built that on my own time, on my personal computer, Henry said. I licensed it to Caldwell for a nominal fee because I wanted the division to succeed. The contract stipulates that the license terminates upon my departure from the company. So, they have nothing, Martha said, a fierce satisfaction in her voice. They have a massive logistical nightmare waiting for them tomorrow morning, Henry corrected. Julian Thorne thought he was cutting dead weight. Instead, he just cut the main artery of his own operation. The next morning, Henry did not put on a suit. Instead, he dressed in comfortable slacks and a sweater. He sat at his home office desk and began making phone calls. His first call was to Thomas Vance, the head of the largest freight union on the eastern seaboard and one of Henry's oldest friends. "Tommy," Henry said when the gruff voice answered. "It is Henry. I am no longer with Caldwell Industrial." There was a long pause on the line. "They fired you after everything you did for that ungrateful outfit." "Restructured," Henry said dryly. "They think they can run the operation without me. I wanted to give you a heads up. You might see some changes in their shipping schedules." "Changes?" Tommy chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Henry, my boys only pushed those expedited shipments through because you asked nicely. If Julian Thorne is running the show now, we go strictly by the book, standard delivery times, no favors, no rushed orders." "I appreciate that, Tommy," Henry said. Over the next few hours, Henry systematically contacted every major supplier and vendor in his network. He didn't ask them to sabotage Caldwell Industrial. He didn't have to it. He simply informed them of his departure and thanked them for their years of partnership. The reaction was universal. The vendors, who had spent years negotiating with Henry's fair but firm hand, were immediately distrustful of the new management. Favorable credit terms were revoked. Volume discounts were suspended pending review. The fragile ecosystem of trust that Henry had cultivated for decades began to collapse the moment he was removed from the equation. Meanwhile, back at Caldwell Industrial, panic was beginning to set in. Julian Thorne arrived at his office to find his inbox overflowing with urgent messages. The custom tracking software, the backbone of their daily operations, was displaying a locked screen with a message indicating that the licensing agreement had expired. Julian stormed down to the IT department. "Why is the logistics software down? Get it back online immediately." The lead technician looked at him nervously. "Mr. Thorne, we cannot. That software is proprietary to Mr. Wallace. He owns the source code. The company only had a user license, which was tied to his employment contract. When he resigned, the system automatically locked us out." Julian's face turned a deep shade of crimson. "Then build a new one, or buy something off the shelf. It will take months to build a custom system that integrates with our legacy hardware," the technician explained patiently. "An off-the-shelf software will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and will not have our specific routing algorithms." Julian retreated to his office, his heart pounding. The situation was deteriorating faster than he could comprehend. Diana Pierce called him, her voice tight with panic. "Julian, 3 of our primary raw material suppliers just informed us that they are reverting to standard pricing models. They are demanding payment up front for all new orders because they say they have no established relationship with current management." "That is impossible," Julian yelled into the receiver. "We have contracts." The contracts had clauses tying the preferential rates to volume guarantees managed by Henry's team, Diana explained. "Without his oversight, they are enforcing the default terms." "Julian, our raw material costs are about to jump by 30%. Felix Harper, the young consultant, walked into Julian's office, looking significantly less smug than he had the day before. "Julian, we have a critical issue on the loading docks. The freight union is refusing to expedite our priority shipments. They are adhering strictly to union regulations, claiming safety concerns. Our outbound deliveries are already delayed by 48 hours. Julian slumped into his expensive ergonomic chair, the realization washing over him like a bucket of ice water. He had thought he was brilliantly executing a corporate strategy to trim the fat. Instead, he had dismantled the very engine that kept the company running. He had fired the only man who actually knew how everything worked. And Richard Caldwell, the CEO, was expecting a progress report at noon. Across town, Henry Wallace sat on his back patio, sipping a fresh cup of coffee. He watched the birds flit among the trees, feeling a sense of profound peace. His phone buzzed on the table. It was an unknown number, but he recognized the Caldwell Industrial prefix. He let it go to voicemail. Martha stepped out onto the patio, holding a plate of fresh pastries. "Was that them?" she asked, a knowing smile on her lips. I imagine it was, Henry replied. Taking a pastry. They are probably starting to realize that agility and synergy are just words, but experience actually moves the freight. What are you going to do? Martha asked, sitting beside him. I am going to finish my coffee, Henry said, looking out over the garden. And then I think I am going to start my own consulting firm. It seems there is a very high demand for competent supply chain management in this city. In fact, I suspect Caldwell Industrial might be my first client, though my rates will be significantly higher than my previous salary. Martha laughed, a bright, joyous sound that echoed in the morning air. The game had completely changed, and for the first time in 30 years, Henry Wallace was finally playing by his own rules. The morning sun broke through the heavy rain clouds, casting a pale gray light over the towering corporate headquarters. Henry Wallace, 58 years old and possessing a weary wisdom that only decades of relentless corporate warfare could forge, stood by his expansive window. He watched the city below, a sprawling maze of concrete and steel. He had spent over 30 years building his division from a small team of 3 into a massive organization, employing over 4,000 dedicated individuals. Yet, despite his monumental achievements, the atmosphere in the executive suite had grown toxic over the last 6 months. The recent acquisition had brought in new management, a ruthless cadre of executives who valued short-term profits over long-term stability or employee welfare. At the center of this storm was Julian Thorne, the newly appointed vice president of operations. Julian was a man of ambition, sharp-suited and sharper-tongued, known for gutting departments to boost quarterly earnings. Julian had brought in outside help to expedite his cost-cutting crusade, hiring Felix Harper, a slick, fast-talking consultant from Zenith Dynamics. Felix was notorious in the industry. His firm specialized in what they euphemistically called corporate optimization, but everyone knew it meant mass layoffs and stripped-down benefits. Henry had seen the signs early. The endless audits, the sudden demands for granular performance metrics, and the deliberate sidelining of veteran staff were all classic Zenith Dynamics tactics. Henry turned away from the window and walked back to his heavy mahogany desk. He picked up a physical file folder, a rare sight in their paperless office, containing printed logs and email transcripts he had meticulously gathered over the past 2 weeks. He knew Julian and Felix were plotting a massive restructuring that would effectively dismantle his division, terminating hundreds of loyal employees while simultaneously outsourcing their critical functions to an overseas vendor with a questionable track record. What they didn't know was that Henry had a crucial ally hidden deep within the company's IT infrastructure. Oscar Bennett, the lead network engineer, was brilliant, eccentric, and fiercely loyal to Henry. Henry had hired Oscar straight out of college 15 years ago, recognizing a raw talent that others had dismissed because of Oscar's unconventional demeanor. Oscar lived and breathed the company's network. He knew every firewall, every server cluster, and every hidden subdirectory. When Henry had first suspected Julian's ulterior motives, he had asked Oscar to keep a close eye on the network traffic originating from the executive suites. Specifically looking for unauthorized data transfers to Zenith Dynamics, the door to Henry's office clicked open and Oscar slipped inside, carrying a thick tablet. Oscar looked exhausted. Dark circles framed his eyes, suggesting he hadn't slept in at least 2 days. I found it, Henry, Oscar said, his voice barely a whisper. He locked the door behind him and approached the desk. It took some digging because Felix is using encrypted tunnels, but he made a mistake. He routed a massive data dump through a legacy backup server that I decommissioned last year but kept online for archival retrieval. He thought it was a blind spot. Henry felt a surge of adrenaline. What exactly did he send? Everything, Oscar replied, tapping the screen of his tablet. Employee performance reviews, proprietary source code, future development roadmaps, and the complete financial projections for the next 5 years. But that is not the worst part. I intercepted a draft of the restructuring proposal Julian sent to the board. It is completely fabricated. He inflated our operational costs by nearly 200% and severely understated our projected revenue. He is trying to make our division look like a massive financial liability. Henry's jaw tightened. He is trying to justify the outsourcing contract. If the board believes we are losing money, they will approve the Zenith Dynamics plan without hesitation. Julian probably gets a massive kickback from the vendor, and Felix gets his hefty consulting fee. Exactly, Oscar said, bringing up a complex schematic on the tablet. But I also found something else. The outsourcing vendor? Zenith Dynamics owns a controlling stake in them through a web of shell companies. Julian is effectively selling our division to Felix's firm, and they are both going to make a fortune while our people lose their livelihoods. Henry took a deep breath, the gravity of the situation settling over him. This was no longer just a corporate power struggle, it was outright fraud. We need to expose this, but if we go to the board now, Julian will deny everything and claim we illegally accessed his private communications. He will have us fired and escorted out of the building before lunch. So, what is the play? Oscar asked, his fingers twitching over the tablet. We need them to expose themselves, Henry said, a plan forming in his mind. We need to trap them in a lie so massive and public that they cannot spin their way out of it. When is the all-hands quarterly review? Tomorrow morning, Oscar replied. Julian is scheduled to present the new operational strategy to the entire company and the board of directors. Perfect, Henry murmured. Oscar, I need you to prepare a presentation, but not just any presentation. I need you to take all the real data, the actual financial projections, the true operational costs, and the proof of the shell companies, and integrate it into Julian's slide deck. Oscar blinked, a slow smile spreading across his face. You want me to hack the boardroom projector? Not the projector, Henry corrected. I want you to replace his presentation file on the central server right before he goes on stage. Make sure he cannot switch back to his original deck. When he clicks to the next slide expecting to show his fabricated numbers, I want the entire company to see the truth. It will be tricky, Oscar admitted, rubbing his chin. Felix is paranoid. He keeps the master file on a secure cloud drive and only downloads it right before the meeting. But I can set up a script to intercept the download request and serve him our modified version instead. He will not realize it until it is up on the massive screen. Do it, Henry said firmly, and make sure you have backup copies of all the evidence, distributed to secure off-site servers. If this goes wrong, we need to ensure the data survives. The rest of the day was a tense blur. Henry went about his normal duties, projecting an aura of calm compliance while secretly coordinating with Oscar. He attended 2 meetings with Julian and Felix, listening patiently as they subtly patronized him, entirely unaware of the trap being laid beneath their feet. Julian was arrogant, boasting about the bold new direction the company was taking, while Felix offered polished, empty corporate jargon. Henry simply nodded, playing the role of the tired, defeated veteran gracefully stepping aside for the new generation. That night, Henry stayed late, long after the office had emptied. He walked the silent floors of his division, looking at the empty desks of the people he had mentored and guided for years. He thought about the families who relied on these jobs, the mortgages, the college funds. He was not just fighting for his own legacy, he was fighting for them. The next morning, the grand auditorium was packed. The entire company had gathered for the quarterly review, a mix of anxiety and anticipation buzzing in the air. The board of directors sat in the front row, looking stern and expectant. Henry took a seat near the back, his eyes locked on the stage. Oscar was stationed in the audio-visual control booth, a pair of heavy headphones over his ears, his fingers flying across a keyboard. Julian Thorne walked onto the stage, exuding confidence. He was dressed immaculately, his smile broad and rehearsed. Felix Harper stood in the wings, watching his partner with a smug expression. "Good morning, everyone," Julian began, his voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Today marks a turning point for our company. We are embarking on a journey of optimization and strategic realignment. For too long, we have been weighed down by outdated processes and bloated operational structures. It is time to lean down, to become agile, and to secure our future in a highly competitive market." He clicked a sleek remote in his hand. The massive screen behind him flickered to life. The first slide was normal, a standard corporate title card. "As you can see," Julian continued, pacing the stage, "our recent analysis, conducted in partnership with Zenith Dynamics, has highlighted several areas of critical inefficiency." He clicked the remote again. Henry held his breath, Up in the booth, Oscar gave a subtle thumbs up. The screen shifted, but instead of Julian's carefully crafted charts showing inflated costs and dire financial warnings, a completely different set of graphics appeared. The title of the slide read, in bold, undeniable letters, "The True Cost of Corruption, a detailed breakdown of corporate fraud." A murmur rippled through the audience. Julian, oblivious to what was on the screen behind him, continued his speech. "Our operational expenses in the legacy divisions have skyrocketed, threatening our core profitability." Julian, one of the board members, a stern woman named Eleanor, interrupted sharply. "What exactly are we looking at it?" Julian frowned and turned around. The blood drained from his face instantly. The slide displayed a complex flowchart linking Zenith Dynamics to the offshore vendor, clearly outlining the hidden ownership structure and the projected kickbacks Julian was set to receive. There is some kind of technical error," Julian stammered, frantically clicking his remote to advance the slide. The next slide appeared. It contained side-by-side comparisons of Julian's fabricated financial projections and the actual, healthy numbers generated by Henry's division. Below the data was a prominent audio icon. Suddenly, a recording began to play over the auditorium speakers. It was Felix Harper's voice, captured by Oscar's network surveillance. "Do not worry about Wallace." The recorded voice of Felix echoed through the silent room. "He is a dinosaur. By the time he realizes we have gutted his department and funneled the contracts to our subsidiary, he will be in early retirement. The board will swallow the inflated cost reports without a second thought. They only care about the bottom line." Pandemonium broke out. The employees began shouting, a mix of outrage and disbelief. The board members stood up, their faces pale with shock and fury. Felix, realizing the magnitude of the disaster, turned and bolted for the side exit, only to be intercepted by company security, who'd been quietly alerted by Henry earlier that morning. Julian stood frozen on the stage, the remote slipping from his trembling hand and clattering onto the hard floor. His carefully constructed empire of lies had collapsed in a matter of seconds. Henry remained seated in the back, a profound sense of relief washing over him. The battle was won. It would take time to clean up the mess Julian and Felix had made, and the board would undoubtedly launch a massive internal investigation. But his division was safe. His people were safe. Oscar emerged from the control booth looking exhausted but triumphant. He walked down the aisle and took the empty seat next to Henry. "Well," Oscar said quietly, watching security escort Julian off the stage, "that went exactly as planned." Henry smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes for the first time in months. He looked at the brilliant young engineer he had mentored, realizing once again that true strength in business did not come from ruthless ambition, but from loyalty, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what was right. "Yes, Oscar," Henry replied, his voice steady and calm. "It certainly did. Now, let us get back to work. We have a company to rebuild." And as the chaotic noise of the auditorium swirled around them, the 58-year-old executive and his brilliant network engineer sat quietly, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The morning of the final board meeting arrived with a heavy, oppressive silence. Henry Wallace stood before his office window, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. At 58 years old, he had dedicated 3 decades of his life to this company, pouring his blood, sweat, and tears into its foundations. He had watched it grow from a modest enterprise into an industry titan. Yet today, he was prepared to tear down its highest echelons to save its soul. The weight of the evidence in his briefcase felt like an anchor, grounding him in reality. It was a complete dossier detailing the massive financial fraud orchestrated by the chief executive officer, Richard Caldwell. Richard had been bleeding the company dry, funneling millions into hidden offshore accounts under the guise of fictitious consulting fees and phantom acquisitions. And shielding him was Edward Montgomery, the slick, highly paid outside counsel who made sure the paper trails disappeared into legal black holes. Henry adjusted his tie. It was time. He walked down the long, carpeted corridor toward the executive boardroom. The doors were heavy mahogany, a symbol of the impenetrable power held within. As Henry entered, the atmosphere was already tense. The board members sat around the massive oak table, their faces tight with anticipation. Richard Caldwell sat at the head, radiating an arrogant confidence that made Henry's stomach churn. Beside Richard was Edward Montgomery, his bespoke suit immaculate, his eyes sharp and predatory as he watched Henry take his seat. "Let us call this meeting to order," the chairman announced, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "We have several pressing matters regarding the quarterly financials. Henry, I believe you requested the floor to present your findings." Henry stood up slowly. He placed his thick leather briefcase on the table and unlatched it. The sharp clicks sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. He withdrew the meticulously organized stacks of documents, handing copies to each board member. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Henry began, his voice steady and resolute. "For the past 6 months, I have been conducting an independent audit of our recent overseas acquisitions. What I uncovered was not an accounting error, nor was it a simple oversight. It was a deliberate, calculated embezzlement scheme." A murmur rippled through the room. Richard Caldwell's arrogant smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his leather chair. "This is preposterous, Henry. You have always been overly cautious, but throwing around accusations of embezzlement is grounds for immediate termination." "Let him speak, Richard," the chairman interrupted, his eyes fixed on the documents Henry had just handed him. "The documents in front of you," Henry continued, ignoring Richard's outburst, "trace a complex web of shell companies. Over the past 3 years, more than $50 million have been siphoned from our operational budgets. The funds were authorized under the guise of legal consulting and international market research." Edward Montgomery stood up, slamming his hand on the table. "Mr. Chairman, I must object. The documents Mr. Wallace is distributing contain highly classified, privileged legal communications. Disclosing them is a direct violation of corporate confidentiality and severely breaches his employment contract. Privilege does not apply when the communications are used to further a crime or fraud, Edward." Henry countered sharply, his eyes locking onto the outside counsel. "The crime-fraud exception is quite clear. You drafted the contracts for the shell companies. You knowingly created the legal smokescreen to hide the stolen funds." The boardroom erupted in chaotic chatter. Board members were rapidly flipping through the pages, their faces turning pale as they saw the undeniable proof: bank transfer receipts, internal emails discussing the diversion of funds, and Richard Caldwell's own signature on the final authorization forms. "This is a fabrication," Richard shouted, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He pointed a trembling finger at Henry. "He fabricated these documents because I passed him over for the chief financial officer position. It is a pathetic, desperate attempt at revenge." "Look at page 42, Henry said calmly, his voice slicing through Richard's panic. "That is a certified bank record from the Cayman Islands, linking the shell company directly to your personal offshore trust. And page 67 contains an email from Edward, explicitly advising you on how to structure the transfers to avoid the threshold for mandatory reporting to the Internal Revenue Service." Edward Montgomery's predatory demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold, panicked sweat. He sat down heavily, refusing to look at Richard. "What is the meaning of this, Richard?" the chairman demanded, his voice shaking with fury. "Is this true?" Before Richard could formulate another lie, Henry delivered the final, devastating blow. "You do not need to wait for his confession, Mr. Chairman. At 8 o'clock this morning, I handed a duplicate copy of this entire dossier to the agents at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Warrants are currently being issued." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a collapsing empire. Richard Caldwell slumped in his chair, the arrogant facade completely shattered. He looked like a hollow, broken man. Edward Montgomery was frantically typing on his phone, likely trying to secure his own criminal defense attorney. Within 30 minutes, the boardroom doors opened again. 2 federal agents walked in, their badges glinting in the harsh fluorescent light. They approached Richard and Edward, requesting they step outside. The executives were escorted from the building in front of the entire staff, a public humiliation that matched the magnitude of their crimes. The board immediately voted to terminate Richard Caldwell and sever all ties with Edward Montgomery's law firm. They turned to Henry, their expressions a mix of profound shock and deep gratitude. The chairman cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "Henry, we owe you an unpayable debt. You saved this company from absolute ruin." Henry closed his empty briefcase. At 58, he felt lighter than he had in years. The heavy burden of the secret, the months of paranoia and stress, had finally lifted. He had stood his ground against giants of corruption and emerged victorious. "I only did what was right," Henry replied quietly. Over the next few months, the company underwent a massive restructuring. Richard Caldwell was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. He faced a lengthy prison sentence. Edward Montgomery was disbarred and faced similar criminal charges, his reputation as an untouchable legal mastermind permanently destroyed. Henry Wallace was offered the position of Chief Executive Officer. He accepted, bringing an era of transparency, integrity, and ethical leadership to the company. He spent his remaining years before retirement rebuilding the corporate culture, ensuring that no one could ever exploit the system again. His legacy was no longer just the decades of hard work he had put in, but the courage he showed in the darkest hour. Justice had not only been served, it had been institutionalized.